Thank you for that introduction, Kathy. I'm going to concentrate and provide some recent evidence around harms, particularly in relation to opioids, but I will also end by some emerging evidence around concerns and harms related to other drugs that are very commonly prescribed for pain, namely gabapentin and pregabalin. You've already seen and heard reference to this paper that was published in Annals of Internal Medicine earlier this year as a systematic review that looked at harms particularly to the individual. As you can see, it was aimed not just to look at harm, but also to consider effectiveness. However, the data for both effectiveness and harms from both randomized controlled trials and observational studies is actually relatively weak. However, there was, as we've already heard, opioids come with increased risks of particularly erectile dysfunction and use of medicines to treat erectile dysfunction in men, of fractures, myocardial infarction, also an increased risk of having or being involved in a motor vehicle accident, and what is particularly relevant to this session around risks of overdose and abuse potential as well. However, there are other risks that are perhaps more commonly associated with other classes of medicines that we use in pain. And this large population-based study, again, that used data from America, suggesting that the incidence of GI bleeds, that of course we would most commonly associated with the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, to actually be higher for opioids as opposed to the NSAIDs or the COX-2 inhibitors as well. And the other data relating to fractures, mortality, and hospital admissions, perhaps less surprising in this case. As I'm sure many of you are aware, a lot of the reasons why harm associated with opioids has really originated from the US in particular, and there are many questions being asked about whether other parts of the world have similar problems. I'm sure many of you have seen this slide where that association between the amount of opioid sold in the US very closely mirrored and had a similar relationship to the increasing number of admissions for treatment of addiction, and also related to the number of opioid-related deaths in the States. Just to update that, this data that came from the World Drug Report that was published just a couple of months ago, actually, although there was a steady increase in the number of opioid-related deaths in the States, up till about 2010 or 2011, seems to have plateaued somewhat over the last few years. But you can also see there a significant rise in the number of deaths related to the use of heroin as an illicit substance in the US more recently. And maybe that is part of the explanation as to why there has been a plateauing of the mortality associated with prescription drugs. However, the mortality rate, or death rate, is really just the tip of an iceberg. For each one of those deaths in the US, back in 2010, there were 10 admissions for treatment of abuse, 25 admissions to emergency departments for similar reasons. But look at the bar at the top, over 700 individuals who had used opioids for non-medical reasons. So the deaths, although concerning, very much a small number compared with the number of individuals who have been exposed to these drugs. Where do most people obtain these medicines from in the US? Perhaps not surprising that the majority actually come from family or friends. And also in the US, you can see that the number of drug-related deaths, again, these are particularly opioid-related, now exceeding the number of people who die because of motor vehicle accidents in the States. The most recent data would suggest that now there are over 20,000 deaths per year associated with opioid-related deaths in the US. And we know that there is a very clear dose relationship. So particularly at doses over 100 milligrams of oral morphine equivalent per day, where there is a significant increase in the incidence of opiate-related mortality. What do policy organisations and reports state about the scale of the problem? You may have come across this document from the UN called the World Drug Report. Again, it shows the scale of the problem, particularly in the US, with over 5 million people estimated to have abused prescription pain relievers. And in other areas of the world, this report was the version published last year, suggesting harm associated with other opioids such as fentanyl in the Balkan states. But otherwise, there is actually few mentions of the misuse of prescription drugs. The World Drug Report from this year made a comment about the shift from prescription medicines to and the changing to heroin, as we have seen in the increase in the number of deaths associated with heroin. And this was in part put down to the availability of abuse deterrent formulations in the US, but also a decrease in the price of illicit heroin. And it also made a comment about an increase in misuse of prescription opioids in Australia. So quite clearly, there has been consideration of this issue throughout the world. Thinking slightly more closer to home, an EU document called the European Drug Report for this year made no mention whatsoever of the misuse and abuse of prescription-related drugs. In the UK, this is some data that is very hot off the press. The drug-related deaths from our Office of National Statistics for last year were only published yesterday. And you can see some interesting trends. Going back to 2005, there has been a steady rise in the increase of number of drug-related deaths associated with tramadol. There's been a decrease in the number of drug-related deaths associated with paracetamol, but there's also been, again, quite a significant rise, particularly over the last couple of years, in those deaths associated with heroin and morphine. And this is, again, thought to be largely due to individuals using heroin for illicit purposes and not people who have been prescribed morphine for pain relief. However, apart from some data from the States estimating the number of individuals who have been using prescription pain relievers for non-medicinal purposes, there's actually very little data that has been published that has been relevant to other countries. Until a few weeks ago, and the publication of the crime survey for England and Wales, that last year, for the first time, asked a specific question about to individuals about whether they had taken a prescription-only analgesic that had not been prescribed for them, and from the understanding the question that they asked, it was very specific and that it was so that a drug that for a purpose for which it was not intended. So in other words, these are individuals who are taking prescription analgesics not for their pain relieving effect, but for other effects. So let's call it either misuse or abuse. And interestingly, over 5% of individuals in the adult range said that they had taken a prescription painkiller over in 2014. As perhaps you could expect, this was more common in younger adults, and it was over 7% in the 16 to 24 age group, but it was and slightly smaller in the older age group. And unlike the population who are, shall we say, habitual drug misusers, this was a different population, because they were less likely to have used another drug of misuse during that time. But there's also an interesting demographic in terms of the population for whom who have been misusing these drugs. On this slide, the red line is the, shall we say, the incidence of respondents who had used illicit drugs. And as you can see, in the 16 to 24 age group, that was over a quarter. But there was a very sudden decrease throughout the aging population. But this has not been mirrored in the same way for those using prescription drugs. And even in the older, shall we say, 59 to 65 age group, there is still a significant proportion of individuals who have been taking these medicines that were not prescribed to them. Another sobering thought that I came across over the last few months, a population-based study that was intended to look at the current use of antidepressants and whether an individual was more likely to commit homicide or murder. And as you can see, that actually there was no clear relationship associated with antidepressants, but both benzodiazepines and opioids were more closely associated with whether an individual was more likely to commit homicide or not. So a sobering thought for a Friday morning. I'd like to just end with a few slides related to harms associated with gabapentin and pregabalin. This is something that, an issue that has been documented in the literature over the last few years. This data from this slide comes from Scotland, where over 5% of attendees at a substance misuse clinic were more likely to be prescribed gabapentin, and were also more than 3 times more likely to admit to non-medical use of analgesics. You can also see that from post-mortem reports, although a relatively small number mentioned gabapentin in their toxicology reports, but quite often these were associated with morphine and opioid or methadone as well, perhaps suggesting opioid exposure and dependence as well. More recently, this has been an issue that is certainly come as a worrying issue to those in the addiction world in the UK. And you can see some quotes here from, first of all, a drug worker from York commenting on the illicit use of both pregabalin and gabapentin, and the problems that and harms that this may cause to individuals. And again, it seems to be particularly individuals with a history of substance misuse of opioids for whom this is a particular problem. But it's not just the UK. In the Netherlands, 12% of urine specimens of patients with an opioid addiction been found to be positive for pregabalin, none of which had been prescribed for medical indications. We've already heard that patients are perhaps more likely to be prescribed opioids if they have a history of substance misuse. And this, from population studies, has been mirrored both for gabapentin and for pregabalin too. So, in summary, we know opioids cause harm and consequences both for individuals but also for society as well. We know that there has been an increase in deaths, particularly in the US. However, the association between deaths and increased prescribing is much less clear in other countries. And this is really hampered by the lack of standardization of methods of recording data. And finally, there are increasing concerns related to other drugs that we commonly prescribe for pain, namely gabapentin and pregabalin. And this is a particular issue for those who have a history of substance misuse. Many thanks.